nation deeply wounded by callous and caring men who plot such heinous crimes with impunity. The cries of our nation are heard from old men who bury their sons and daughters, wives who weep for their husbands, communities who endlessly bury young and old, infants and pregnant women. This killing must stop. Those were the words of President Nelson Mandela in 1993, shortly before he declared April 14th Memorial Day for anti-apartheid icon Martin Tambisile Chris Hani. 4 days earlier, Hani was brutally murdered when a Polish immigrant and white nationalist drove 4 bullets into him at a close range in his driveway. Hani was killed about a year before Freedom Day when he could bear witness to the start of a pivotal period in South African history. His killer was sentenced to death, but a year after the actual murder, death penalties were abolished in South Africa under the new regime. For nearly 3 decades, Janusz Waluś has sat in prison. Half of this time he had been eligible for parole, but he never really left the confines of his prison cell. Last week, a constitutional court ruled that he be released in 10 days. So barring any last-minute changes, Waluś will be released tomorrow. The release of Waluś has sparked outrage among South Africans. The ruling ANC, along with its alliance partners, the South African Communist Party and Congress of South African Trade Unions, picketed outside the Constitutional Court last weekend in response to the court's decision. So what happens next is why we're here on the square. Thanks for joining the gathering here on the square. I am Keminni Amanor. Let's now meet our guest. Alex Mashilo is national spokesperson for the South Africa Communist Party. And then we also have Vusi Gumbi, who is research assistant at the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation at the University of Johannesburg. My understanding is that we have lost Alex from the SACP, but we would work the lines and bring him back on the square. Right now, let's welcome Vusi to the square. Vusi, you're welcome to the program. Let's start off quickly. What are your thoughts and reactions to how things have turned out since the Constitutional Court ruling?
Hi, thank you for having me. I think it's important to understand that we do not have to choose either or, that two truths can coexist. The one way of looking at it is that the anger and the outrage is just a result of the fact that in 1994, as Africans in this country, we forgave people who never asked for forgiveness. South Africa remains polarized. White people are still racist. And that's why you see the outrage, to even in the instance of Janusz Waluś, to say, has he shown remorse? One of the contentious issues is the fact that he has still not said who actually ordered the hit to kill Chris Hani. So while legally he qualifies for a parole, the question is this a person morally and otherwise who's deserving of this parole? Looking at the fact that when Chris Hani was killed, it almost brought South Africa to a civil war. It almost whitewashed all the progress that had been made since the release of political prisoners, the multi-party negotiations, CODESA, the drafting of a new constitution, and so on. So the anger is a reflection of South Africans who believe that Chris Hani has not been vindicated. Even what he fought for, even what he died for, things have not really changed. White people are the same as they were 29 years ago when he was killed.
Very well. Now, I just want us to go back to something that you said. So the country has forgiven people who did not even ask for forgiveness. From where you sit, why do you think this case is different?
It is different because Chris Hani was the foremost leader of the South African Communist Party. He became the embodiment of socialism and communism, and that what is largely drove the liberation movement. If you will recall, the justification for, the suppression of black people, of the ANC at that time, the jailing of Nelson Mandela and his colleagues was largely because they were called communist terrorists. But then once they were jailed, the person who then took the mantle and really became the embodiment of this philosophy and of this political ideology became Chris Hani. And that is largely what informed the armed struggle, the liberation movement. And when the likes of Mandela had somewhat became complacent, that somewhat, were easily agreeable to say, okay, we might not necessarily go the socialist route, we might not necessarily go the communist route. Chris Hani was one of those people who were resolute in the fact that we must nationalize the mines and the bags. We must make sure that we eradicate poverty, change the education system. So he was one of those people who were not unforgiving in their pursuit of a socialist state in South Africa. And that was a threat to the social structure of South Africa. That was a threat to the wealth of white people in South Africa. And him being killed was not merely the death of a leader, it was the death of an idea which one leader had took a conscious decision to champion when the rest had abandoned those ideals.
Well, Vusi, I'm going to come back to you. Alex just joined our conversation. If you just joined us also, Alex Mashilo is national spokesperson for the South Africa Communist Party. Alex, you're welcome back to the program. The SSCP has not only condemned the Constitutional Court's ruling, but it went ahead to go on a protest to express its disappointment at the decision. Now, tell us why the decision of the Court is unacceptable.
If you read if you followed the text of the judgment delivered by the Constitutional Court Chief Justice Raymond Zondo, it will be very easy for you to conclude that there were only two parties in the matter, that being the side of the Minister of Justice and Correctional Services, Ronald Lamola, on the one hand, and the convicted assassin, Janusz Waluś, on the other hand. There are very few references in the text that he delivered to the Chris Hani family and to the SACP. What that means is that the written and oral submissions made by the Chris Hani family and the SACP through our legal team were not given equal consideration in the judgment. If you read that judgment, it will be very difficult for you to conclude what the Chris Hani family and the SACP argued in presenting their submissions in the court. You will find only passing references. There is no legal assessment of the substantive submissions that we made. This is one of the reasons why Chris Hani's wife, Dimpho Hani, concluded that the process of justice was used to deliver a decision that was unjust. And because of that, our legal team is making an assessment of the legal route that we have to follow, not only in South Africa, but also on the African continent. Because we cannot say that there are no other avenues for us to follow to realize justice for Chris Hani if the Constitutional Court will maintain the judgment that it delivered on Monday, the 21st November.
Very well. So one of the arguments that have come since the outrage, particularly from Home Affairs, would seem to suggest that their hands were tied legally in giving Chris, I beg your pardon, in giving Jans back his permanent residency in South Africa. Have you heard this response from Home Affairs, and what do you think about that?
We have seen the response by the Home Affairs, and thank you also for asking that question. You know, from the beginning, when Janusz Waluś arrived in South Africa, the way he was granted the South African citizenship was questionable. It was like, it was fast-tracked. Secondly, the way the Department of Home Affairs previously revoked that citizenship was unquestionable. They said that they revoked his citizenship because of the crime that he committed. He committed this crime in 1993 on the 10th of April. The citizenship was revoked in 2018. I mean, for all these years, the Department of Home Affairs was aware that Janusz Waluś was the trigger man who assassinated Chris Hani in cold blood. Secondly, if they indeed mean what they did, that this man assassinated Chris Hani, and which is the reason why they revoked his citizenship, surely they had to consult with the Chris Hani family and the South African Communist Party, the same way as the South African Parole Board and the court gave us a hearing before the judgment of the Constitutional Court. So the decision by the Home Affairs was irregular. The Home Affairs has to take steps itself to take that decision to court for review. It happened under questionable circumstances. So we understand that the current Minister of Home Affairs, Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi, has taken steps to make a special permit for Janusz Waluś to remain in South Africa in order to serve his sentence. I must say the following. When a prisoner is placed on parole in South Africa, that prisoner has not finished serving their sentence. You finish serving your sentence after finishing the parole. What is happening at the current moment may render the decision of the Constitutional Court unimplementable. Because if you go to the same judgment that the SACP and the Hani family are disappointed about, the judgment says that the Minister of Justice and Correctional Services must determine the conditions under which the convicted assassin will serve his parole. Hang on. One of those conditions is that the man must remain within the borders of South Africa. So if this guy wants to leave, that means that he is rendering the implementation of the Constitutional Court judgment unimplementable. And that may surely, in hours to come, give rise to a new legal battle.
Very well. So here's what I'm talking about. Janusz right now cannot leave South Africa, and in order for him to have come on parole, then it means that he should have had legal residency also in South Africa. So Home Affairs has told local media, particularly the SABC, that they have granted Janusz permanent residency in the country in order to allow him serve the rest of his sentence on parole. How does this come to you? What does this mean for the protests the SACP has been on?
Remember that as the SACP, our standpoint working together with the Chris Hani family is that the convicted assassin in the first place must not be granted parole. However, if it happens that in the legal battle and the protest action we are undertaking, we do not achieve what we want, we will totally oppose this man leaving South Africa, because that will be a violation of the very unacceptable or disappointing Constitutional Court judgment. This person is not released, has not finished serving his sentence. According to that judgment, he has to serve parole. Parole in which country? The country of jurisdiction in which he committed the assassination. So what the Department of Home Affairs did is understandable. What will just have to happen is to verify whether it was in terms of the law. If it is not in terms of the law, the implementation of the Constitutional Court judgment will have to wait. This man must remain in prison, and the Constitutional Court will have to clarify where this man will have to serve parole, because he cannot be released from South Africa. He has to complete his parole here. That's what has to happen if we indeed finally lose and are unable to maintain him, to maintain his stay in prison. So, and I must say that as part of this, we have organized another protest. We are going to the Kgoshi Mampuru prison in Tshwane tomorrow to protest against his release. And our legal team is busy working on the papers that we will be filing, and then we will give further details in due course.
We'll talk about the legal step you're taking, but just hold your thoughts for me right now. Let me come to Vusi now. Vusi, you had my conversation with Alex. Legally, what are the options for, those who are against the decision by Concord? Particularly because there are people who can serve life sentences without the possibility of parole. Why is it different in South Africa?
I think it is important to understand that Janusz Waluś getting a parole is as a result of the conscious decision that South Africa took in the build-up to the first democratic elections, that it is going to be a constitutional democracy. So, although the release of this assassin brings so much pain and opens up old wounds across the political divide, and particularly amongst Black people, it is also important to let it be known that the law can never be applied emotionally, nor should it be applied on the basis of who it is in relation to, right? Because even the man in question himself, our hero, Hani, he did not fight for a South Africa in which some people's lives matter more, but for one in which we are all equal before the law and otherwise. So it is almost hard to fight against, the parole of this man, because legally speaking, he qualifies for parole because his sentence was then converted from death to life. Life in South Africa is 25 years. And if you, again...
Well, I think we lost Vusi there, and so I'll come back to Alex. Hopefully, Alex is still over the Zoom connection with us. Alex, let's talk about the significance or otherwise of this ruling by Concord. What does it mean for the entire struggle up until now? You're muted.
Legally,
well, I can hear you now.
Okay. Legally, we have rights. There are legal procedures and after the Constitution is not the end of the road. There are other legal channels. There is also a difference between the interpretation of the law and the law itself. There is also a difference between constitutional democracy and the interpretation of the Constitution itself. That is why even judges do not agree. If you look at the Constitutional Court judgment, it overturned several other judgments that were reached by the judges of the High Court and the Supreme Court of Appeals based on the interpretation of the same Constitution. And the same Constitution also provides a procedure legally to return back to the Constitutional Court. So unless the entire road is exhausted, we cannot say that this is the end of the road. In addition, South Africa is a member of the African Union. There are international mechanisms that we can follow. Now, the significance of the judgment, if truth be told, is as follows. And it is not about black and white, because in the South African Communist Party, we have white people. In the African National Congress, we have white people. In the Congress of South African Trade Unions, we have white people. And these white people that we have been together with the SACP and the Hani family opposing parole for Janusz Waluś. So what has happened in terms of its political implications? The judgment redivided South Africa between, on the one hand, the perpetrators of apartheid, who are unremorseful, who are unrepentant, and who celebrated the judgment. And on the other hand, the victims of apartheid, who are deeply hurt and disappointed by the judgment. At this moment, South Africa is a divided society. What remains to be seen is the direction that the divisions will take. At this moment, the redivisions are playing themselves anew. We are not going to fold our arms in the redivisions. As I explained, we are organizing protests and we are following legal considerations and strategy.
Well, and these legal considerations will be to stop the release, I suppose.
We want to make sure that every step in the process is lawful and complies with the law. And we will be returning to the Constitutional Court in due course with an application. Unfortunately, at this stage, I'm unable to open up our documents and say this is the route. But as soon as our legal team has filed the documents, I will be happy to outline what the documents are saying and what we seek to achieve.
Very well. You talk about divisions as far as this ruling is concerned. We've heard about the vandalism at the memorial site for Chris Hani. Is this the beginning of the degeneration of that division?
The beginning of the degeneration of the division was with some white racists in Krugersdorp celebrating the judgment. And on the weekend now, the damage that was caused to the Chris Hani memorial site, we consider that damage, in fact, as part of the continuing assassination of Chris Hani in his grave and the perpetuation of the divisions, of course.
Very well. We'll turn attention to Vusi now. Vusi, thank you for coming back. We had the connection tripped earlier, but you were talking to us about the legalities of this. But I want us to move quite a bit from that and talk about what's happening now, the aftermath, where we've seen the vandalism of the memorial site for Chris Hani, and as Alex has just told us about the celebration by one person that came along with the decision. What are your thoughts on this, and perhaps how can we make sure that this does not degenerate further?
It's a ticking time bomb, in my own opinion. It's very much hard to contain this thing. It's something that you cannot contain. Instead, the best way actually points out to the fact that there are some racists who are celebrating this thing. You might have picked it up also yourselves as a media house that right now in South Africa, there's a voice note that is making rounds by a white racist old woman talking about black people being killed, black women as ovaries being removed, black people being killed and being banned, right? And this was as a result of the fact that in the last couple of weeks, we've had pit bulls, killing people and things like that. So it is very hard until we get to a point where white people themselves understand and admit that they did a lot of damage to black people and that our black leaders themselves have failed us. They do not and have not shown the political will to reverse, what happened during apartheid, to change the social structure, and the fact that to talk about apartheid and its effects in South Africa. Till this day, the Jews talk about the genocide. The Jews talk about the genocide from one generation to another so that they conscientize them about this matter. But as black people, we don't. You know what I'm talking about. So it is very hard to contain this thing. Like I said, South Africa is a polarized state. White people in this country are racists. They defend apartheid. They defend colonialism. At some point, the leader of the second biggest party in this country defended colonialism. So it is a ticking time bomb that in the end will result in a clash between the whites and blacks, or the haves and the have-nots, because white and black is easily translated between the rich and the poor in this country.
Alex, how can we make sure that this ticking time bomb does not go off?
For my next appointment, but there are some points made by Vusi which are very important. Not only black people, but we need a non-racial approach to eliminate the legacy of apartheid and colonialism, and to appreciate that the oppression or the domination of African countries has not ended. We are being dominated now under imperialism, which is controlled from North America and Western Europe. things are not so much different now in Africa under independence than they were under colonialism and apartheid. We have imperialist oppression through institutions anchored in the United States, and this oppression plays itself out in the curriculum, in books.
Alex, did we lose you?
I think you did lose me there. So if you look at the policies followed by African countries, those policies have not worked. And if you check as to who is behind those policies, it is the imperialist countries, institutions, and organizations. So we have a long way to go to uproot the legacy of colonialism and apartheid.
Alex, just before I let you go.
We have to do it. We have to do it.
Very well. Just before I let you go, I know you mentioned earlier you're late for another appointment. Tomorrow, you say that the SACP and all its friends will be going to picket at the prison where Janusz will be released. But in the course of the conversation, Vusi here made a comment about the need, the fact that the country is forgiving people who have not even asked for forgiveness. So here's my question. Why can't Janusz be forgiven?
Janusz committed an act that brought South Africa to the brink of civil war, defending the apartheid regime in opposition to a democratic transition from apartheid. He is an unrepentant assassin who has refused to make full disclosure of the truth. You cannot be considered to be repentant, to have been to be a changeman, if you refuse to make full disclosure of the truth. The assassination of the magnitude he carried out could not have involved only him and Clive de Belouis. There are others who were involved in drafting the hit list. There are others who were involved in stealing or taking the weapon he used from military armory, moving it from point to point. The Constitutional Court refers to only Janusz and Clive de Belouis planning the assassination in weeks and weeks and weeks. Clearly, there is evidence from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that denied them amnesty on the basis of having failed to make full disclosure of the truth, that they could not have been the only two men responsible for the act that they have committed. We want the truth, and only the truth, and all of it, and nothing else. Everybody involved in the assassination of Chris Hani has to be brought to book. Until that happens, we cannot say there has been justice in the case of Chris Hani.
Very well, Alex, I'm grateful for your time. Alex Mashilo is national spokesperson for the South Africa Communist Party. And we've been talking about the release of Janusz Waluś, who is held for the killing of Chris Hani, an anti-apartheid icon. Still with me here is Vusi Gumbi, who is a researcher at the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation at the University of Joburg. We'll be right back here on The Square as we learn more about the man Chris Hani. Stay with us.
News Central TV, Africa's #1 storyteller, has come with the best of both worlds. With a combination of news app and live TV, we ensure that you keep track of the latest headlines, breaking news, and in-depth analysis from professional journalists from around the continent. Download the News Central TV app on Android and iOS and get started today. Don't forget to follow us on News Central's social media platforms. News Central, Africa First.
Thank you kindly for staying with us here on the program. Still with me is Vusi, and we're discussing the release of Janusz Waluś, who is held or has been held the last 3 decades for the killing of South African anti-apartheid icon Chris Hani. Vusi, of all the things that you have said about South Africans being more compassionate, when you look at how events are starting to degenerate, and like you said, it is a ticking time bomb, you think that perhaps Janusz should be held in custody until things settle. What are your thoughts about that?
My thoughts about this, as you talk about South Africans, obviously people hail our beautiful constitution as being the best in the world. it draws us to the question of whether or not we didn't go overboard with the negotiations, whether or not we didn't compromise too much. Maybe if we didn't concede too much, why people would respect us in this country, why people would stop treating us like stepchildren in this country. So for me personally, as a black person in South Africa, I don't think that the release of this man and the reaction from white people. I mean, I was reading a headline that he's being revered and celebrated by Polish right-wing football supporters. So for me, it's a question of, didn't we concede a lot? Didn't we compromise a lot during the negotiations?
Because
And
even
I
now,
think
Vusi, there would appear to be a lot of compromise, especially because, look, when Janusz is released on parole, I do not believe that Janusz has a place of his own after 3 decades in South Africa. It will definitely fall on the taxpayer again. And it would seem that, look, this is too much in the face of all that is happening. It's a slap in the face of the struggle up until now. Don't you think so?
for me, this person has not shown any remorse towards the death of Chris Hani. He has not repentant. He's unrepentant. He's a racist, a right-wing racist. And but obviously, when we look into the law in South Africa, like I said, we cannot be emotional, and that's just the unfortunate part about it. To say that's what separates the courts of law from people like myself, because they apply, logic, and because he was charged with a murder, and it will be treated like a murder, like any other case, regardless of the fact that who that person was, and his role and position in the South African society. So from a legal point of view, obviously we can't argue about it, but from a societal point of view, from a moral degeneration point of view, from a racial point of view, there's no way that you can say a man like this one deserves any form of courtesy from South Africans. So even the fact that he's going to serve his parole in this country, the fact that taxpayers will have to foot the bill for this thing, it makes it even more difficult for white people in this country to respect us. That is why white people in this country will continue to, be boastful about apartheid, about racism, and hence I say that we don't have the political, and dare I say even the citizen will to deal with racial problems facing this country. That is why people are able to celebrate at this man being released.
Very well. Now, I want us to spend the last few minutes on knowing the man, Chris Hani, particularly for those outside of South Africa. Who was Chris Hani? And if you could share with us the era within which he was killed.
Chris Hani, like I said, he became the foremost socialist, communist, anti-apartheid leader in the country. When senior leaders of the movement, your Nelson Mandelas of this world, were more agreeable to a compromise, he became that one leader who was steadfast in the attainment of a socialist state in South Africa. And that spoke directly to making sure that the strategic sectors of the economy represent the broad demographics of our population, which threatened the very hegemony of white people in this country. That's the type of leader this man was. And when he was killed at the height of, obviously the black on black violence between the ANC and the IFP. He was killed as South Africa was going, to the multi-party negotiating forum, carving the way into a democratic South Africa. He was killed at an era where, the sun was setting on apartheid and democracy was within sight. And he was one of the people who was championing a socialist state where blacks and whites could live freely and all enjoy and reap the benefits of South Africa. And unfortunately, he could not see that materialize because unlike all these other, anti-apartheid activists, the likes of Chris Hani, the likes of Winnie Mandela were resolute in the fact that we need to make sure that not only do we attain political freedom, but we also attain economic freedom.
All right, Chris, take us home now. What would be your advice to South Africans regarding the decisions they take going forward in order not to undo what the struggle has been able to achieve up until now? As far as they are able to express their disappointment at the Concord decision.
It is important to understand that in 1994, the government changed, but the social structure remained the same. So we cannot say that we are just in a democratic state and that everyone has free opportunities.